Let's next look at DMX input, audio input, and MIDI input triggers into Mosaic. Starting with DMX input. MSCs can directly receive DMX input. Tesseras and MSC-Xs can receive DMX in via ArtNet or SACN. To configure this, first let's take a look at the Network tab. Select the controller we want, and notice there's a DMX input field. You can choose to disable it, have ArtNet, or SACN. You can then set up your universe. Once this is configured, you have the option to choose which channel it will listen to in this trigger. Each trigger can listen to a single channel. You then have the option to choose whether it enters the range or changes in range and set a minimum and a maximum. So for instance, if I want to trigger when channel 1 goes to full, I'm going to change my enter range to be 255 to 255. And that will only trigger when it's fully at 255. If you want to detect any form of change in range, we can set this to change in range and give it a little bit more variance. Enters range is generally more useful when you're using DMX to trigger timelines, but changes in range would be required if you want to use a DMX channel as a variable for something like set intensity. Taking a look at the audio input trigger, this requires the presence of a Rio A in the system. The Mosaic Rio A has a stereo balanced line level audio input that can be used as a trigger. To use the trigger, select the Rio A that you'll be working with. Use the channel setting to specify whether the trigger should match against the left or right audio channel, or the combination of the two. Now select which frequency band to use, or leave the set to the overall volume of the channel. Each Rio A can analyze incoming audio up to 30 frequency bands. The peak checkbox tells the trigger to match on the decaying level of the last peak in the audio frequency band. Finally, specify the range of the values to trigger on. You can choose whether to trigger every time the value changes within the specific range, or to only trigger when the value enters the specific range. Enters range is generally more useful when you're using an audio to trigger timelines, but changes in range would be required if you're using an audio band as a variable for something like set intensity or rate. Lastly, let's take a look at MIDI input. MIDI signals can be received locally into MSCs or via the Rio A. Once you've selected which device, hit Edit to open the message builder. You can add messages in either short message, MSC, or extended. Each of these has a number of configuration options. Please reference the manual for more information on using MIDI.